So who do you think is being hurt more by the Ukraine war? Russia and all the sanctions we're putting on them, or the United States? The answer just may surprise you. Or will it? The answer is the United States. Despite sanctions and boycotts, Russia could still rake in $800 million a day from oil and gas this year, more than it pulled in last year. As we pay $9, we're literally $9 a gallon in Mendocino County, California. CBS News, Russia's ruble is the strongest currency in the world. Strongest currency in the world. Russia is winning the economic war, and Putin is no closer to withdrawing troops. The perverse effects of sanctions means rising fuel and food costs for the rest of the world, and fears are growing of a humanitarian catastrophe. Sooner or later, a deal must be made. He's not in a hurry to get a deal. He doesn't need a deal. You know why? But he wants a deal. He'd rather have peace right now. He's willing to negotiate and have diplomacy. You know who's not? The United States and Zelensky. That's a fact. Is America the real victim of anti-Russian sanctions? And this is written by Arnaud Bertrand. Oh, I think I know that guy. Remember the claims that Russia's economy was more or less irrelevant, merely the equivalent of a small, not very impressive European country? Putin, who has the economy the size of Italy, said Lindsey Graham in 2014 after the invasion of Crimea, is playing a poker game with a pair of twos and is winning. Of increasing Russian diplomatic and geopolitical influence in Europe, the Middle East, and in East Asia, The Economist, the newspaper The Economist, asked in 2019, how did a country with an economy the size of Spain achieve all this? Seldom has the West so grossly misjudged an economy's global significance. French economist Jacques Sapir, who teaches at the Moscow and Paris schools of economics, explained recently that the war in Ukraine has made us realize that the Russian economy is considerably more important than we thought. For Sapir, one big reason for this miscalculation is exchange rates. If you compare Russia's gross domestic product by simply converting it from rubles to US dollars, you indeed get an economy the size of Spain's. But such a comparison makes no sense without adjusting for purchasing power parity. That's called the triple P, purchasing power parity, which accounts for productivity and standards of living, and thus per capita welfare and resource use. And when you measure Russia's GDP based on the triple P, it's clear that Russia's economy is actually more like the size of Germany's, about 4.4 trillion for Russia versus 4.6 trillion for Germany. From the size of a small and somewhat ailing European economy to the biggest economy in Europe and one of the largest in the world, not a negligible difference. Sapir also encourages us to ask, what is the share of the service sector versus the share of the commodities and industrial sector? The United States, we're all service sector. He's saying they make stuff. To him, the service sector today is grossly overvalued compared with the industrial sector and commodities like oil, gas, copper, and agricultural products. If we reduce the proportional importance of services in the global economy, meaning if we take off the jobs like of maid service and waiters, if we get rid of those, Russia's economy is vastly larger than that of Germany's and represents probably 5 to 6% of the world's economy, more like Japan than Spain. This makes intuitive sense. When push comes to shove, we know there is more value in providing people with things they really need to survive, like food and energy, than there is in intangible things like entertainment or financial services. The current crisis in Ukraine has helpfully clarified how much we've taken for granted the antiquated side of modern economies like industry and commodities, prices for which have surged this year, and perhaps overvalued services and tech, whose value has recently crashed. The size and importance of Russia's economy is further distorted by ignoring global trade flows, in which Sapir estimates Russia may account for maybe as much as 15%. While Russia is not the largest producer of oil in the world, for example, it has been the largest exporter of it, ahead of even Saudi Arabia. The same is true for many other essential products, such as wheat, the world's most important food crop, with Russia controlling about 19.5% of global exports of wheat. Nickel, they have 20% of nickel, and the semi-finished iron, 18%, platinum, and frozen fishes. They have 11% of the world's frozen fishes. Such commanding importance in the production of so many essential commodities means that Russia, like few other countries on the planet, is in many respects a linchpin of the globalized production chain. Attempting to cut the Russian link has meant, and will likely continue to mean, a dramatic reorganization of the global economy. It's worth thinking about what China's economy looks like when we remove the same blinkers with which we've always viewed Russia. If we consider the Chinese economy based on exchange rates by simply converting China's GDP from Chinese yuan to US dollars, it is valued at about 17.7 trillion as of 2021, compared to 23 trillion for the United States and 17 trillion for the European Union. But if we adjust for PPP, we see that the Chinese economy reached almost 27 trillion in 2021, compared with 20.5 trillion for the EU and 23 trillion for the United States. In terms of PPP, in fact, China's economy overtook America's economy 6 frickin' years ago. And what if we reduce the proportional importance of the service sector relative to the industry? About it? Well, then, so you get it. I don't have to give you any more of this. How much does any of this hair splitting matter? For one, the war in Ukraine and tensions in the Pacific look to be accelerating a division of the world into Cold War-like political and economic blocs. But whereas the West accounted for over 50% of the global GDP at the beginning of the Cold War, with the United States dominating global manufacturing and running huge annual trade surpluses, now the West looks to be in a weaker, if more entrenched position of power today, and its major adversaries stronger in certain ways than the communist bloc was in 1948. Before we enthusiastically embrace a new Iron Curtain, therefore, it's worth pausing to consider how many countries in the world will voluntarily place themselves on our side. So they're saying we're starting a new Cold War, and how is the world going to shake out? The West only accounts for about 13% of the world's population, with China and Russia together making up 20% of the world's population. That leaves about 2/3 of humanity not aligned with either of them, the United States or Russia, a position that most of them would like to maintain. If we force them to choose a side, we may be surprised by the many of the results. A tally of the countries participating in current sanctions on Russia, in fact, makes it hard to say whether a new Iron Curtain is being drawn around our adversaries or around the West itself. Countries and nominal U.S. allies, as significant as India and Saudi Arabia, they've been particularly vocal in their refusal to take sides in the conflict in Ukraine. One telling barometer for this dynamic is oil. With Western oil sanctions on the world's largest oil exporter, prices have predictably skyrocketed, rising from around $75 a barrel at the beginning of the year to now $110 a barrel. But countries that have refused to participate in sanctions are now taking advantage of the opportunity to negotiate for Russian energy deliveries at steep discounts. If Russia is still able to sell oil around the world, countries like India are able to negotiate for below market prices, and Western consumers are being hammered with inflated prices. Who is really being sanctioned? The United States is being sanctioned. We're sanctioning ourselves. A similar principle applies to the weaponization of the U.S. dollar and the Western financial system in general. If non-Western countries are increasingly told that access to dollars and transaction systems like SWIFT, so that's that big thing that we kicked Russia out of. If being in systems like SWIFT are conditional on policies made in Washington that may not necessarily be in their own self-interest, the result may be a de-dollarization of the global economy, not a strengthening of the Western. So he's saying that's a big mistake when we kicked Russia out of SWIFT. And the final slide, it's possible that the West, in a fit of self-righteousness and a need to satisfy various domestic demands, may be dividing headlong into a future in which the global South and many others besides feel increasingly pressured to make a choice they don't want to have to make, and which may leave the West more isolated than ever before in modern times. We are effing ourselves with this whole Ukraine, trying to own Russia so we could, and this is all about us selling more liquefied natural gas to Europe. That's what this is all about. What do you make of that story, Jackson? You know a lot about Russia and Ukraine.
I think it's pretty incredible, and it's definitely accurate. The one thing I want to point out, though, is when the author of that article mentioned that, you know, there's a lot of the global population that is currently living in non-aligned countries. A lot of these non-aligned countries are preferring to do trade now with Russia and China because A, they understand that they have the commodities, B, they understand that they're good partners and will trade in preferential currencies, and C, Russia and China, at least for now, who knows what will happen in the future, but at least for now, they're not treating smaller countries like the US treats smaller countries. They're not, you know, lording over them and empire building and keeping these people poor. Instead, China, Russia, when you look at the countries they're working with, like Kazakhstan or Cambodia, they're investing in their economies. They're not debt enslaving them, but they're instead working on industrializing their economies to try and build a better future, which is something that they would obviously prefer. So that's the future that I think we can expect to see. And that's a bad forecast for us living in the United States.
We're taking a swing at Putin, and we're punching ourselves in our collective dicks. Here we're doing stand-up comedy in Los Angeles on June 11th, and then we're going to Chicago, Sacramento, and San Diego on July 16th for the taping of my new special. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all tickets. See you there.